Over the course of the 1800s, millions of people would come to Australia in search of a new life and greater opportunity. One of these was King O'Malley, an eccentric salesman who would go on to be elected to the first Australian Parliament in 1901. Here, he would go on to play a significant role in the development of one of the country's largest banks, the Commonwealth Bank, the Trans-Australian Railroad, as well as the creation of the capital city of Canberra. However, despite all these accomplishments, O'Malley's life is shrouded in a series of contradictions and mysteries, with researchers not being exactly sure where O'Malley came from, how old he was, and if King O'Malley was even his real name. This was made even more difficult by the fact that O'Malley would constantly change and exaggerate stories of his past at different points in his life in order to serve his own personal and political interests. Therefore, in order to understand who O'Malley was, we are going to have to start by looking at the world he first emerged into. Now, long-term European settlement of Australia began with the arrival of the first fleets in 1788, with the three major social groups during this time being convicts, the British officials who watched over them, as well as the countless Aboriginal communities. And despite Australia's reputation as having first been settled by criminals, before the 1770s, most British and Irish prisoners sentenced to transport had been shipped over to the American colonies, with more than 50,000 people having been sent there by 1775. But as a result of the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and the creation of the United States, this is no longer possible. As a result, by the 1780s, it led British prisons to start overflowing with criminals, with many people even being held on converted prison ships along the coast. Therefore, in order to get rid of these prisoners and in order to establish a British presence in the Pacific, convicts started being shipped over to Australia. And over the next few decades, with the arrival of more and more prisoners, as well as free immigrants, several new settlements began to spring up in the colony. With the discovery of gold in the 1850s and the ensuing gold rush, bringing in thousands of new immigrants to Australia, leading the population to go from just under 500,000 to almost 1.7 million in just 20 years. With an industrialized society eventually forming, made of largely European migrants, but also significant communities of native Australians, Chinese, Indonesians, Pacific Islanders, and even some Afghans, with the Afghan being a catch-all term at the time for anyone that might be Middle Eastern or from British India, with thousands of people having come to Australia to start new lives as farmers, gold miners, whalers, or businessmen. And in order to celebrate 100 years of colonial rule, a large international exhibition was held in Melbourne in 1888, with this also marking the first year that we can find a verifiable record of a man named King O'Malley in Australia. Now, during his lifetime, when asked what brought him to Australia, O'Malley would offer a few conflicting stories on why. The first was pretty mundane, with O'Malley claiming to have arrived in Melbourne to represent the interests of a company at the exhibition. The other story was much more fanciful, with O'Malley claiming to have traveled the world after his first wife died of tuberculosis, with tuberculosis being responsible for almost a quarter of all deaths in Europe and the Americas during the 1800s. However, as a result of his travels, he ended up catching tuberculosis himself. This led him to travel with a coffin from San Francisco to Rockhampton, a rural community in Queensland, Australia. Here, he ended up living in a cave, where he was eventually cured by an Aboriginal man named Chowonga. Now, while the second story is almost certainly made up, the first one does contain some truths. For example, records have uncovered a photograph of O'Malley at the International Exhibition, along with details that O'Malley was representing a glass company from Pennsylvania. However, no other documentation has been found to verify this, and when looking deeper into records of his past, an even more complicated story begins to emerge. Now, later in his life, O'Malley would claim to be Canadian. However, it's much more likely he was actually an American who was born in eastern Kansas sometime in the late 1850s, with O'Malley apparently being the son of two Irish immigrants, William O'Malley and Ellen King. Now, it's important to note that many stories of O'Malley's life and his family background are very difficult to verify, as the original source for almost all these claims is often O'Malley himself. However, certain elements of O'Malley's life do line up with larger historical events. For example, during the 1840s and 50s, many Irish immigrants did arrive in the United States, with almost 2 million people having fled the Great Irish Potato Famine. And during this same time, the United States Congress had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and formally opened up these lands for American settlement. However, the act also stated that residents of each new territory could vote to either be a slave state or a free state. Therefore, along with the many settlers who came to establish a new life for themselves in the American Midwest, there was a large-scale influx of pro- and anti-slavery activists. This essentially turned Kansas into a battleground between these two opposing forces, with many buildings being burned to the ground and dozens of people being killed in the following years, with this being the environment that O'Malley was most likely born into and grew up around. Now, the next major event of O'Malley's early life was the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. This because after his father was allegedly killed in the fighting, O'Malley ended up being sent back east to live with some relatives in New York. Here he started working in banking with an uncle of his, before moving on to insurance. And by the 1880s, American newspapers began to report on a man named King O'Malley, who had started to make a name for himself as a respected salesman and political activist. With the papers reporting that O'Malley was originally from Kansas and had spent some time in Texas, before becoming a well-known figure in insurance circles in Chicago, Illinois, and the American West Coast. With O'Malley even going on to help to establish a new headquarters for the home life insurance company in the boom town of San Francisco during this same time. With San Francisco soon growing from a small fishing village to a large city with hundreds of thousands of people as a result of the California gold rush. In terms of politics, King is said to have campaigned for Republican presidential candidate James Blaine against Democrat Grover Cleveland in 1884, with O'Malley describing himself as an Irishman, a Catholic, a Republican, and a Prohibitionist. Now, this was an odd combination of political identities for the time, as the Prohibitionist movement was often connected to nativist and anti-immigrant sentiment, especially against Irish Catholics, who were often caricatured by Protestant Americans as being drunks and criminals. And despite the Republicans being the dominant political party in the US after the end of the Civil War in 1865, Irish Catholics were staunch supporters of the Democrats. In fact, it is said that one of the reasons why Grover Cleveland was able to win in 1884, becoming the first Democrat to be elected president in almost 30 years, was because the party was able to get the support of the millions of new Catholic, Irish, and German immigrants who arrived in the United States. Now, after the election, O'Malley continued to find success in the insurance business. However, a scandal soon emerged when the home life insurance company suddenly fired O'Malley and a friend of his, when it was discovered that they had apparently scammed tens of thousands of dollars from their customers, with this being worth at least $1 million in 2025, with bank records showing that around this same time, O'Malley withdrew all of his money, before suddenly disappearing from the US entirely. With the next record of O'Malley showing that he was on a boat headed to Australia as a tourist. So it looks like the real reason he ended up going to Australia was because he was actually fleeing arrest and jail time in the United States. Now, after the end of the exhibition, for the next couple years, O'Malley apparently returned to selling insurance, with O'Malley spending most of his time in Melbourne and on the island of Tasmania, with this being where he enacted a series of marketing schemes in order to help expand his insurance business. In one notable instance, when a local clergyman in Tasmania prayed for there to be an earthquake in the hopes that it'll make more people become religious. And then, when one occurred, O'Malley, along with a comedian and a land speculator, sued the priest for having ruined their businesses, with this lawsuit helping O'Malley get some free publicity. However, he ran into some trouble again when Tasmania's oldest bank collapsed in the 1890s, leading him to eventually leave for Western Australia. Now, although it's uncertain exactly what happened next, many people believe that this is when O'Malley was able to gain most of the wealth that sustained him for the rest of his life, with one possible explanation for these riches being that he just happened to get lucky with another gold rush that occurred in Western Australia during the 1890s, or it could have been the result of another one of his schemes. It is unknown for certain. With this also being when O'Malley came into possession of an expensive diamond and opal pin, which became an iconic part of his public image for the rest of his life. And now that he had some money, O'Malley ended up settling in Southern Australia and became more involved with local politics, with O'Malley running as an independent for a seat in the local state parliament in 1896, on a platform of free education, pensions for old people, better pay for bureaucrats, better divorce laws for women, prohibition, as well as opposition to immigrants coming from Asia or the Pacific Islands. O'Malley also supported the Federation movement, which called for the 6 separate colonies of Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania to join together into one nation. With these views being popular enough with the general public, especially women who had just gotten the right to vote, that it allowed O'Malley to be elected to the local South Australian Parliament. Now, during this time, O'Malley transformed himself again, going from being an American to now claiming to be a Canadian from Quebec. With the main reason for this probably being that as an American, O'Malley could not legally hold office in Australia, but if he was a Canadian, that would have been fine. This because during this time, Australia and Canada were both still part of the British Empire, and the people who lived in these countries were both British subjects, with separate Australian and Canadian citizenship not even coming into existence until after the end of the Second World War, in 1947 and 1949. Meaning that, by adopting a Canadian identity, it made it much easier for O'Malley to live, work, and more importantly, be involved in Australian politics. Now, changing one's past in order to get ahead in life wasn't that unusual for the time, with many people in the 1800s, including immigrants, often doing this in order to gain greater access to social mobility, as well as acceptance in a new country. This can be seen in the case of the prominent Stirling family of South Australia. Their founder, Edward Stirling, was a wealthy Scotsman who arrived in 1839. Here, he was able to grow the family fortune through a series of investments into some local businesses as well as some copper mines, with Edward even being elected to the local parliament in 1855. And with these riches, Edward was able to live a comfortable upper-class life, with Edward even being able to send his sons, Lancelot and Ted, to study at Cambridge University in England, with Lancelot going to be a successful politician in South Australia until 1932. However, it was later discovered that Edward Sterling was actually born in Jamaica to a Scottish father and a black mother, who was most likely enslaved, with Edward hiding his African heritage once he left the Caribbean, in order to avoid any racism he might face when starting a new life for himself, first in Scotland, and then in Australia. Now, there was also another notable Australian politician who changed his past and went even further in politics, who was also a contemporary of O'Malley's. This was Chris Watson, the first Labour Prime Minister of Australia, who throughout his life claimed to have been born to a British father and a white New Zealand mother, with Watson having spent most of his childhood in British New Zealand before moving to Australia as a young man. However, it was later discovered by researchers that Chris Watson was actually born Johann Christian Tank in South America to a Chilean father. Now, it is unknown if Watson himself was aware of his true name or place of birth, as it seems as though his mother did her best to hide this information from the public, because if this news had gotten out, it would have made Watson's political career much more difficult, as he most likely would not have been allowed to be elected to the Australian Parliament, let alone become Prime Minister. Now, for the next few years, O'Malley's time in the local parliament was mildly successful, as he helped to pass some laws related to marriage and improving the local infrastructure for trains. However, another scandal emerged when a man named William Moorhead published some newspaper articles revealing that O'Malley had scammed people while working for the home life insurance company in New York. Moorhead even went on to say that he had known O'Malley back when they both lived in America. Concerned that the news that he was actually an American could lead to the end of his political career, O'Malley decided to challenge these claims by successfully suing Moorhead in court. However, despite this legal victory, it looks as though this scandal, as well as the ensuing lawsuit, had damaged O'Malley's public image enough for him to lose his re-election campaign in 1899. As a result of this, O'Malley moved first to Melbourne, before heading back to Tasmania, where he attempted to be elected to the local parliament in 1900. Here, O'Malley ran on a similar platform of supporting free education and government pensions, but he notably added some pro-mining policies and dropped his support of women's rights, this probably being because women could not vote in Tasmania during this time. However, despite these changes, O'Malley still lost this election. Now on January 1st of the next year, 1901, the colonies of Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania finally joined together to form one nation, with the push for federation coming as a result of three main concerns: free trade, paranoia about non-white immigration, and the formation of an Australian national identity. Now, while they were still colonies, these 6 states would often level tariffs or import taxes, not just on other countries, but against each other. And while this helped to raise money for the separate colonial governments, it made it very difficult and more expensive for people and local businesses to work together, as tariffs would increase the price of goods whenever it crossed a border, with the free trade movement wanting Australia to be one country so that these local tariffs could be eliminated. Now, these economic concerns also extended to worries about immigration, largely from China, but also the Pacific, with many white Australians worrying that Asian and Pacific Islanders could outcompete them for jobs by being able to work for longer hours and lower salaries. Therefore, the anti-immigration movement wanted Australia to be one country so they could have a national policy to keep Australia white, by preventing immigration from neighboring Asian countries and the Pacific Islands, while continuing to encourage immigration from Europe, especially Britain and Ireland, with these concerns also leading there to be a push to establish a national army to protect the country from a formal foreign invasion. And finally, by the 1900s, a unique Australian identity had also begun to emerge, with there now being distinct Australian folk heroes, foods, and even sports leagues, with this helping to further distinguish local Australians from their British rulers. Now, when this country was established, a new national Australian parliament was also created to govern it. And when elections were held for the first time in 1901, O'Malley ran for and won a seat in the local House of Representatives. Now, since Australia didn't have a permanent capital yet, the first parliament met in Melbourne, with the parliament being made up of 3 main political camps. This included those who continued to support free trade and wanted to extend free trade to other countries, the protectionists, who wanted to impose national tariffs in an attempt to protect local industries, and the labor movement, who advocated for the interests of white Australian workers. And despite the opposition of the British government, one thing that unified all 3 groups was the policy to keep Australia white. With only one elected politician, Bruce Smith, an English-born businessman and lawyer, consistently opposing the White Australia policy in Parliament. This because, as a prominent anti-socialist and member of the Free Trade faction, he saw it as hypocritical to limit where immigrants to Australia came from and who they could work for. This because during this time, many Australian labour unions were effectively whites-only organizations, with some groups even going so far as to violently attack minorities who attempted to work in their industry. Now, after being elected as an independent, O'Malley formally joined the Australian Labor Party, which was the smallest party at the time, but they were able to govern by making an alliance with the Protectionists against the Free Trade group. And during this time, O'Malley would meet and eventually marry a woman named Amy Horton. This was an older marriage for the two, as by this time, O'Malley was in his early 50s, while Amy was in her mid-40s. Now, although O'Malley had earlier claimed to have been a Catholic, they ended up marrying in a private Presbyterian ceremony, with O'Malley's religious life being even more convoluted than his personal one, with O'Malley claiming to have been a Catholic, a Wesleyan, and even the founder and bishop of his own religious group, known as the Water Lily Rockbound Church of Texas. The last one likely having been another scheme by O'Malley to exploit the Texas land grant system back when he lived in the United States. This because when O'Malley first founded the Rockbound Church, the state just happened to be giving out land to religious groups, with the church apparently disbanding rather quickly after it was discovered that O'Malley and a man named Mr. Angel had been faking miracles in an attempt to gain more followers. Now, after getting married for the next couple of years in Parliament, O'Malley's main cause was pushing for the creation of a national bank, and after several years of debate, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was finally created in 1911 under Labour Prime Minister Andrew Fisher. However, O'Malley ended up being disappointed, as the bank differed a lot from his original plan. However, this didn't stop O'Malley from claiming the title of Father of the Commonwealth Bank for the rest of his life. Now, this might surprise many younger Australians, because in the 2020s, the Commonwealth Bank is not run by the government anymore, and is instead a public company. This because during the 1990s, under another Labour Prime Minister, Paul Keating, the Australian government sold off their interest in the bank, allowing it to come under private ownership. Now, two major issues during O'Malley's time in Parliament was a debate over the construction of the Trans-Australian Railroad and where the new capital of Australia should be, as well as what it should be called. This put O'Malley in an interesting position, as by 1910, he had been made the Labour Minister of Home Affairs, giving him a great amount of control over the construction of the railway and of the new capital. Now, during the early 1900s, Western Australia had pushed for the construction of a new railway line in order to better connect the eastern and western states. This is because during this time, the West was relatively isolated, making it very difficult to trade and travel with the rest of the country, with the main form of transportation between the different states still being traveling by boat along the coast. Therefore, the construction of a new Trans-Australian Railroad, connecting Port Augusta in South Australia and Calgary in Western Australia began in 1912. Now, while O'Malley was overseeing the project, concerns about mismanagement and cronyism were raised, especially after O'Malley began handing out jobs to local Labour Party activists, even if they didn't have the right experience or background. However, O'Malley defended himself by saying that it was the policy of the Labour Party to give preference to union members when building new government projects. Now, for the construction of the capital, a new site in New South Wales was eventually chosen, with the location being between the two largest cities of Melbourne and Sydney, with the government settling on the name of Canberra for the capital, with O'Malley announcing that there would be an international competition for the design of the city. And by 1912, over 130 entries had been submitted from over 15 countries from around the world. Now, when it came to choosing a winning design, in order to make the judging process more fair and to remove any bias, it was decided that the government would look at the different proposals without knowing the names of the original architects or the designers, with a design by the Chicago-based architect Walter Burley Griffin being chosen as the winner of the competition, Griffin having been a protege of noted American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, second place went to Alil Saarinen, with that name probably sounding familiar, as Saarinen was a noted architect in Finland and later the United States. However, most people would probably be more familiar with his son, Eero Saarinen, went on to design Dulles International Airport near Washington, D.C., as well as the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, just as construction of the new capital was about to begin, it was soon interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. And soon, a political debate emerged over whether Australia should draft their subjects to help Britain in their fight, with pro- and anti-draft factions soon emerging on the issue. The anti-draft faction was largely made up of German Australians, labor unions, and working-class Irish Catholics. This is because many German immigrants did not want to fight against the German Empire. The labor unions didn't want to lose any of their members, and by 1916, the Easter Rising had broken out in Ireland, with many Irish immigrants supporting the fight for Ireland to be an independent republic, free from British rule. While the pro-draft faction was largely made up of Australians who supported the British Empire, white-collar businessmen, and middle-class Protestants. Now during this time, the early 1900s Liberal Party supported the draft, while the governing Labour Party was split on the issue, with O'Malley largely associating himself with the anti-draft faction against the pro-draft faction, which was led by party leader and Prime Minister Billy Hughes. With Hughes and O'Malley butting heads so often that Hughes even tried to have him removed as Minister of Home Affairs. This divide within the party eventually became so contentious that Hughes and his pro-draft faction end up forming a new party called National Labour. They then merged with the rival Liberal Party to form the Nationalist Party. Interestingly, when this alliance happened, the Liberal Party was led by Joseph Cook, a former Liberal Prime Minister of Australia, who also used to be a member of the Labour Party, and had even helped to establish the party in New South Wales. As a result of this, during the next election in 1917, it produced an interesting situation where several former leaders of the Labour movement, such as Cook and Hughes, end up campaigning against the Labour Party itself. And when this new Nationalist Party won in a landslide, O'Malley ended up losing his seat in Parliament to the Nationalist candidate, Charles Howroyd, with Howroyd notably going on to pass away after only 5 days in Parliament. Now, after losing his position in politics, O'Malley would attempt to run for office again in 1919 and 1922, but after failing both times, he finally gave up on governing. And during this same time, he decided to visit the US for the first time in almost 30 years, with O'Malley traveling cross-country from Seattle to New York. He allegedly even stopped in the middle of his trip to visit a brother of his who was living in the rural town of Kelly, Kansas. And after returning to Australia, King O'Malley spent the next 30 years building up the legend of his life, with O'Malley eventually passing away in 1953 at the age of 95 as the last remaining survivor of the first Australian Parliament, outliving his former rival Billy Hughes by a little over a year. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks so much to my patrons, Untroid, NMS, and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.